The last wire transfer was for $200. He sent it from a Colombia branch in Envigado, standing at a teller window while a security guard watched the door, on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2022. He had $600 left in his Colombian account after that. He had $1,840 in his American one. His apartment lease expired in 19 days. His return flight, one way, booked on a credit card with a $3,000 limit he had opened 6 months earlier because every other card he owned was either maxed or closed, was scheduled for the following Thursday. The teller asked him something in Spanish. He didn't understand her. He had lived in Medellín for 7 years and he still did not fully understand her. He nodded anyway. She processed the transfer. He walked outside into the Envigado heat and sat on a bench near a fruit cart and did not move for 45 minutes. That $200 was not for Valentina. Valentina had been gone for 14 months by then. That $4,200 was for a man in Panama City who had promised him he could recover $60,000 of what he had lost. It was the last money Thomas Edward Calloway would ever send to anyone in Latin America. The total, across 7 years, was $341,200. I want to be careful about how I present this story because it is easy to reduce it to something simple: a naive man, a manipulative woman, a predictable ending. That is not what happened here. What happened to Thomas Calloway is more complicated, more slow burning, and in many ways more troubling than the stories you typically hear about men losing money to romance scams. Because Valentina Restrepo Castaño was not running a standard scheme. She was not a stranger behind a screen. She was a woman he genuinely knew, lived beside, and in his own accounting, loved for years. And the money did not disappear all at once. It was absorbed, gradually, by a family, by a life he was invited to join and slowly bled to maintain. Thomas sent me his account in 4 separate voice messages totaling nearly 3 hours. He asked me not to include his current city or employer. Everything else, the names, the amounts, the sequence of events, he told me to use exactly as it happened. If this could happen to Thomas Calloway, it could happen to almost any man sitting where he was sitting in 2015. And a lot of men are sitting exactly there right now. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. And if you are new here, one tap on the subscribe button costs you nothing and keeps this channel going. My name is Thomas Edward Calloway, and I need to tell you about 7 years of my life that I will never get back. 2. I was 53 years old. In January of reasonable measure, done everything. I had spent 26 years in industrial equipment sales, the unsexy end of American commerce, selling hydraulic press components and conveyor systems and replacement parts for machines that most people never think about, to manufacturers and distribution centers across the Midwest. I was not the flashiest salesman in the room. I was not the one who closed deals over golf and bourbon. I was the one who knew the spec sheets cold, who showed up when he said he would, who returned calls on Saturdays. That reliability had made me a comfortable living. I lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I had owned my house out since 2008, a 4-bedroom colonial on the north side of the city that I had bought in 1996 with my then-wife Karen for $187,000 total and paid off early. 1 extra principal payment a year, every year, until the balance hit zero. Karen and I divorced in 2011. Not dramatic. Not because of anything either of us did in particular. She would tell you, and she would be telling the truth, that I was never fully present, that I was reliable in the way a piece of furniture is reliable, always where you left it, never demanding anything, but not particularly warm either. I did not fight the divorce. I paid what I owed in the settlement without argument. We split the equity on the house and I bought her out. She moved to Columbus to be near her sister. We have a workable relationship now, built around our 2 children. My son Derek, who was 27 in 2015 and working in IT in Denver, and my daughter Cassie, who was 24 and finishing her master's in social work in Bloomington. After the settlement, my liquid net worth was approximately $540,000, spread between a 401(a) I had been maxing for 20 years, a brokerage account, and savings. The house was worth roughly $230,000 at that point. My income was $118,000 a year in base plus commissions that some years hit $40,000 more. I was not wealthy. I was solidly comfortable. And I was very, very alone. I don't say that to invite sympathy. I say it because it is the truth that made everything else possible. And I spent a long time pretending it wasn't true. Fort Wayne in the winter, living alone in a 4-bedroom house that still had Karen's paint choices on every wall. I hadn't repainted a single room. Was a particular kind of quiet. I cooked dinner for one. I watched whatever I wanted on television without negotiating. I kept the thermostat at 68 because there was no one to fight about it with. It should have been freedom. It mostly felt like waiting. I started watching videos online about living abroad sometime in 2013. I didn't take it seriously at first. It was something I did after work the way other men my age watched sports highlights. A low-stakes form of entertainment about a life that was not mine. Arbitrage, they called it. Take your American income or savings, move somewhere your dollar buys 4 times as much. Live like a king on a fraction. I watched videos about Portugal, about Thailand, about Bali. Then I found a channel specifically about Medellín, Colombia, and something shifted. The videos about Medellín were different from the others. The men making them were not retired hippies or digital nomads in their 20s. Some of them were my age. Some had come from careers like mine. Sales, contracting, small business ownership. They talked about the weather, which is genuinely remarkable, 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, almost every day of the year, because of the altitude. They talked about the cost of a good apartment, around $600 to $900 a month, in neighborhoods that would cost $4,000 or $5,000 in any equivalent American city. They talked about the food, the coffee, the culture, the pace of life. They talked somewhat carefully about the women, not in a predatory way, or at least not obviously. They talked about Colombian women as though they were simply a feature of the place, the way the weather was. A feature, something pleasant that happened to be there. I am aware of how that sounds now. I did not decide to move. I decided to go for 3 weeks and see. That is how I framed it to myself and to Derek and Cassie, who were both cautious about it, in the way adult children are cautious when a parent starts doing something unfamiliar. "Just a trip, Dad?" Cassie asked. I told her yes. Just a trip. I booked a round-trip ticket to Jose Maria Cordova Airport for March 2015. I reserved an Airbnb in El Poblado for 3 weeks at $65 a night. I told my manager at work I was taking vacation time I had been stockpiling for 3 years. And I packed a single-checked bag and a carry-on. I told myself I was just going to look. Men who tell themselves that are usually already decided. ACT 3. Honey Medellín in March is not what most Americans imagine when they imagine Colombia. The Colombia in the American mind is still 1993. Still Pablo Escobar, still the news footage that played on a loop when we were young. That Colombia exists in memory and in Netflix series and almost nowhere else in the city I landed in. El Poblado in 2015 was gleaming. It was cafes with exposed brick and specialty pour-over coffee and young professionals in good clothes sitting with laptops. It was tree-lined streets and apartment towers with rooftop pools. It was a neighborhood that would not have looked out of place in Bogotá or Santiago or parts of Miami. The transformation of Medellín since the early 90s is real and documented, and was, I understand now, one of the things the city was actively selling to people like me. I will not pretend I was not seduced immediately. I was. The Airbnb host, a woman in her 50s named Gloria, had left a basket of fruit on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note. The coffee she had left in the cabinet cost about 40 cents a cup and was better than anything I had ever bought at a Starbucks. I stood on the small balcony the first morning at 7 a.m., and the air was cool and the city was spread below me, and I thought, this is the most alive I have felt in years. That thought arrived with no warning and surprised me. Within the first week I had found the expat world, which in El Poblado in 2015 was not difficult to find. There was a bar on Calle 10. I will not name it. It is still open, where expats gathered on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Americans, Canadians, a few British, some Australians, men mostly, though not exclusively. Men in their 40s and 50s and 60s, almost all of them in some versions of my situation, divorced or widowed, or simply done with wherever they had come from. They were accountants and contractors and former military and retired firefighters and one man who had sold a small chain of car washes in Ohio for enough to live on indefinitely. The ones who had been there longer served as informal guides for the newer arrivals. They were generous with information in the way people are generous when they are proud of a discovery they want to share. Where to find a reliable apartment, which neighborhoods were safe and which to be cautious in, how to open a Colombian bank account, where to eat, what to pay for a taxi. One of these men was a man I will call Rodrigo, though that was not his name. He was Colombian, not an expat. a fixer, in the vocabulary of that world, a local man who made himself useful to foreigners for money and connections and the social proximity to people with dollars. He spoke excellent English, had lived briefly in Miami, dressed well. He found me within the first week, introduced by another expat at the Tuesday bar gathering. He was warm and knowledgeable, and I liked him immediately. I did not know until much later that Rodrigo knew Valentina, that their connection predated me by years. I met Valentina Restrepo Castaño on my 17th day in Medellín. The context matters. It was not a bar. It was not a nightclub. It was a Sunday brunch at a rooftop restaurant in Provenza, Zona Rosa, the upscale section of El Poblado, to which I had been invited by an American couple, Jim and Susan Hartwell from Phoenix, who had been living there for 2 years and had become something like my anchors in the city. Jim had built up a small consulting business working remotely for American clients, and Susan had become involved in a nonprofit working with displaced communities in the communas. They were serious, grounded people. I trusted them. The brunch was their gathering, their friends, their table. Valentina was there as the guest of a Colombian colleague of Susan's from the nonprofit. She was 34 years old. She had a degree in business administration from Universidad de Antioquia and worked as a project coordinator for an NGO that handled housing grants in low-income neighborhoods. She spoke English with a careful, deliberate precision, as though she had learned it formally rather than absorbed it, which she had. She had her own apartment in Laurels, a 10-minute cab ride from El Poblado. Not in the expensive tourist neighborhood, but in the solid, quiet residential one where actual Medellín families lived. She had a cat named Simone. She had been in a 4-year relationship that ended badly and had, she said, not dated seriously since. I did not sit next to her at that brunch. I sat across the table, which meant I spent 2 hours watching her talk to other people and deciding that I was not going to make it obvious that I found her interesting. She laughed in a particular way, with her eyes before her mouth, the smile arriving a half-second late, as though she was checking herself. She was not performing for the table. She was, if anything, slightly reserved. She asked me 2 questions during the entire meal: what I did for work and whether I had visited any neighborhoods outside El Poblado yet. Both questions felt like genuine curiosity rather than the polished social gymnastics of someone working a room. I got her number from Susan Hartwell, who gave it to me with a raised eyebrow and a small nod that meant, yes, she seemed interested. No, I am not going to make a production of this. We had coffee the following Thursday at a place in Laurels, near her apartment. She arrived first and was reading something on her phone when I walked in, and she looked up with an expression that contained no performance of delight, just a straightforward acknowledgement. I liked that. I had spent 2 decades around salespeople. I could feel performance from across a room. Whatever she was doing, it did not feel like performance. The conversation was slow at first, then easy. She asked about Fort Wayne in a way that made clear she had actually looked it up. She told me she had grown up in Itagüí, a working-class municipality just south of Medellín. Her mother, 2 younger sisters, and an uncle who helped raise them after her father left when she was 11, still lived there. She was the only one in her family who had gone to university. She said it without any particular pride or bitterness, just as information. Over the next 2 weeks, we had 3 dinners and 1 full day together that included a walk through Park RV, the large ecological reserve above the city, reached by cable car, where she packed a bag with food from the Palo Comau market because, she said, the food at the park was overpriced and bad. She paid for the cable car tickets. She corrected me twice, gently, when I tried to pay for things when it was. She said clearly her turn. I remember that specifically. She paid for things. I noted it, registered it as a sign of a woman who was not looking to be kept, and held it as evidence of something I wanted to believe was true. By the end of my 3-week visit, I had extended my return ticket by 10 days. When I finally flew home to Fort Wayne, I sat in the plane and felt the particular melancholy of returning to a life that had been perfectly adequate until you had glimpsed something else. I was back in Medellín 4 months later. I signed a 12-month lease on an apartment in Laurels, 2 blocks from Valentina's building, for $720 a month. I told my company I would be working remotely with quarterly trips back to Indiana. They agreed reluctantly, and then eventually not reluctantly, because my numbers did not drop. I did not tell myself this was permanent. That was the story I told. But I shipped 3 boxes of books, my good kitchen knives, and my mother's cast iron pan. You do not ship your mother's cast iron pan to a temporary situation. Valentina and I became, without any formal declaration, a couple. She spent 3 or 4 evenings a week at my apartment. I spent weekends at hers. On Sunday mornings she made changua, a Colombian milk and egg soup that sounds wrong and is extraordinarily comforting. And we read and talked, and I learned, slowly, what it meant to be genuinely comfortable with someone rather than simply not uncomfortable. She introduced me to her mother, Doña Elena, in November 2015, 8 months after we met. The house in Itagüí was modest and clean, with a small yard and a shrine to the Virgin on the living room wall. Doña Elena served bandeja paisa and spoke no English and communicated her evaluation of me through Valentina's translations and her own careful watching. I did not speak much Spanish then. I would learn enough to have a limited conversation, but never enough to fully navigate one without help. Valentina's younger sister, Mariana, was 26 and working at a call center. Her other sister, Gabriela, was 22 and still in school, studying to be a nurse. The uncle, Ramiro, worked construction and lived nearby. They were ordinary people with ordinary lives who had very little money. I understood that. I was not bothered by it. I had grown up in a family that had had stretches of real financial pressure. Money was not something I looked down on anyone for lacking. I should have been more precise about what understanding that meant in practice. I was not. One thing I noticed but did not yet have a category for: the way Valentina watched me with her family. Not anxiously, not proudly, exactly, assessingly. As if she was running a calculation she did not need to announce. Looking back now, I think she was deciding how far the situation could go. I thought she was nervous about introducing a foreign boyfriend to a traditional family. Both things may have been true. The calculation does not require the feeling to be false. That is the part that takes the longest to understand. I did not notice the calculation. I noticed the changua and the Sunday mornings and the way she said my name, which sounded different in her mouth than it ever had in mine. By March of 2016, 1 year after I first landed at Jose Maria Cordova, I had renewed my lease, transferred my primary banking to a Bancolombia account, and begun telling people that I lived in Medellín. Not that I was visiting, not that I was trying it out, that I lived there. I had also, without fully registering it as a pattern, spent $14,300 on things I thought of as relationship costs. Dinners, trips to Cartagena, gifts for Valentina, and small things for her family. A phone for Mariana, whose old one had broken. A medical copay for Doña Elena's knee that the Colombian healthcare system was slow to cover. These were not presents extracted from me under pressure. They were things I noticed needing and offered. That is an important distinction, and also, I have come to understand, not as much of a protection as I thought it was. The family had learned what I was willing to offer before I had.